Keir Starmer's only been Prime Minister for 5 months and things haven't gone exactly to plan.
We've had a row over freebies, the farmer drama, £22 billion of budgetary black holes, a race riot, a budget that's pissed off a lot of people, cuts to support for pensioners, disappointing economic results, talk of a third world war, the worst possible result in the US elections, and now reform is on the rise.
So this week, Keir Starmer is busy seizing the agenda. Whatever you want to call it, it's a reboot. To Keir, to Starmer. We're recording Pod Save the UK the day before he sets out his plans for change. It promises to be radical, to have a relentless focus on working people's priorities, and to give us measurable milestones.
Will this be a word salad of broad missions and milestones, or a real attempt to nail down what this government can achieve? To help us figure it out is political journalist and friend of the show, Zoë Grünewald. Zoe, welcome back.
Thank you.
Nice to see you.
Yeah, nice to see you guys.
So I guess the big question is, why, Zoe? Why?
Why? Well, you might have noticed it's been a tough few months for Labour. They have had, as you pointed out, lots and lots of different issues.
It's a honeymoon period, but a honeymoon where everyone got diarrhea.
Yeah, yes, yeah, it really is. And I think they are feeling like the narrative is slightly getting away from them. And I don't think they're wrong. And I think there's also a feeling that they possibly went into this slightly wrong. You know, they went into this saying everything's really, really bad. It's going to take us 10 years. Bear with us. Not really accounting for the fact that, yes, people understand that the economic situation's really bad, public services are on their knees, but they did vote for change. That was the platform Labour stood on, and that means they're expecting results. And then there was all the stuff about freebies. There's been issues with various cabinet ministers. There's been a whole raft of problems, and I think Labour now want to refocus, bring it back and focus on actually what they can deliver. So that's what the speech is going to do. It's going to focus particularly on 3 targets, which is reducing immigration, although I don't think we're going to get a number. So it's a slightly strange one. Increasing disposable incomes. And this is the idea that they are going to basically sort of scrap just the kind of concept of growth targets. And I think part of this is because if you look at what happened in the US election, the economy was growing, but if people don't feel it, it doesn't really make a difference. So they want people to feel an economic change, and cutting NHS waiting lists. Again, I'm not sure if there'll be an exact number. I would imagine there might be for this. But they think immigration, cost of living and NHS, they're sort of tend to be top 3 voter priorities in a lot of voter groups. If they can make tangible changes there, they are hoping that they will keep people with them for 5 years.
I sense I know the answer to this already, but do we know that there's going to be actual concrete policy announcements that go with this?
I suspect there will be, because otherwise, how do you announce it? Whether or not there'll be specific numbers and whether it's like, so today we're going to get on with doing X is a different question. They're kind of keeping their powder dry on this because they do want people to pay attention. They do want to announce things and have the front pages. You know, they want the public to see that actually they're really getting on with the job now, you know, quite a few months in.
I mean, I can see the logic of it. I don't think the average person remembers the numbers of the targets. You know, they just have a general sense that things have improved. But then that does make it hard to hold them accountable against it, right?
It does. And if you look at Rishi Sunak, so he had his 5 targets and he didn't achieve cutting NHS waiting lists or stop the boats. And in fact, he banked on there just being economic growth because that's what economists were telling him. But none of those targets, he was actually doing anything measurable to try and enact them. And when he didn't meet them, they were really easily thrown against him during the general election as you have failed on your promises to the British people. I think this is slightly different because actually Keir Starmer does have a big majority. Yeah. He has a large mandate. He can actually get things done. Rishi Sunak could not get anything done because he couldn't get his party to agree on anything. So he chose targets he thought, they'll probably happen. NHS waiting lists are bound to go down. The economy will probably grow. And actually it was a lot more difficult than that. So I think there is a stronger chance of Labour meeting their targets and choosing targets that they know they can make a difference to. But you're right, if you don't meet them, that can be very politically problematic. And some of the things that are going on in politics are out of your control. So if you look at what's happening internationally, you know, you look at how international conflict, for example, affects energy prices. You can't account for that. So there is a risk to it, but I think they are hoping that if they can show policy changes and then point to the exact mechanism that they brought in that created that policy change. So, for example, building new homes, they can say that's because we reformed planning laws. People might say, okay, I do feel like they're consequential, they're making a difference.
And what do you think is missing in all of this? Because, I mean, the way you've outlined it there, it all seems to kind of make sense. And, you know, I do recall those pictures of Starmer looking like a head teacher that's caught you in the wrong shoes. Change. I remember it vividly. And people do want it. But what are they missing on? What's not being communicated here?
So I think the biggest problem is that Labour are just not communicating a vision of what they want Britain to look like and what government they are. There was a sense going into the election in Labour circles that actually what voters just wanted was security. They wanted financial security. They wanted to feel secure walking the streets. They wanted to feel like their kids had a secure future. They wanted to feel like Britain nationally was secure. And actually what they didn't want was to constantly be thinking about politics and to constantly thinking about who's left the cabinet and what latest arguments going on. I think that is true. After years of scandal, people wanted to hear less about politicians. But I don't think it's true that that meant that they just wanted a government that sits back and gets things done in a kind of managerial sense. I think actually there was an appetite for change and probably something quite radical. And they thought just saying, the adults are in charge, we're going to fix this, leave it with us, would go down well. Actually, it hasn't, because people's lived experiences are that actually everything isn't working, and they voted for a different government to do that. And I think now what Labour's realising, and why they've had this sort of shake-up at the centre, they got rid of Sue Gray, they put Morgan McSweeney very much in charge of the operation, is that they want to be selling something to the public, and they've realised that is very, very important. The question is, what is that? And is Keir Starmer the right person to sell a message? He's not inspiring in that way, you know? And same with Rachel Reeves as a chancellor. She's very managerial. None of them are painting a picture of what Britain is going to look like in 10 years' time.
Why wasn't there a plan? Like, I'm not fond of using the first 100 days as a measuring stick for prime ministers, because that's something that we associate more with an American government. But at the same time, why was there no attempt to seize control and put policies in place? Because the material conditions are not 1997. Blair and Brown were able to come in and coast on an economy that was in recovery. And then after 2 years, Gordon Brown was able to say, look, we've met all of their financial rules, but now we're going to change things up because we see the country needs it. And that was a political tactic, and it worked very well. But in this situation, now going into this winter, the NHS is in crisis. The schools are in crisis. Everything is in crisis. Why did Labour not arrive in office with a policy plan to deal with the sort of multifaceted collapse of Britain as a country?
Yeah, firstly, I think actually the timing of the election did slightly surprise Labour. It was earlier than many predicted. Right. I think they were slightly taken off guard by that. And I think we should really hold Rishi Sunak and the Conservatives accountable for having a political strategy, which is, I am going to call the election at a time which will cause the most discomfort to the next government, make it most difficult for them to govern, just because it might give us a better chance of seizing power again in 5 years. I mean, that's not ethical leadership. That's very opportunistic.
That's sort of written into the Conservative Party.
It is.
Message in a stick of
like
rock.
Number one, take to power.
Burn the country to the ground and then make it difficult for them. I
think that was one of Boris Johnson's pledges that he did stick to, in absolute fairness.
And he did well on that, yes. I think they were very focused on winning, laser focused on winning. And part of that was being incredibly cautious, as you say, basically just straddling the centre ground, not wanting to rock the boat at all. And I think the preoccupation with winning dwarfed the preoccupation with governing. You know, it was suddenly like, oh my God, now we're in power. What do we do? I don't know why they didn't call an emergency budget like straight away, you know? And there was this suggestion that they don't get a proper look at the finances until they're in government. Well, a lot of it is public. You know, there are conversations going on with the IFS. They do pre-election work with the civil service. There are things you could do. I mean, some of this has been put on the shoulders of Sue Gray, possibly suggesting it's her fault. I don't know how much of that is Labour briefing, factionalism stuff. I think it's a bit unfair to just blame Sue Gray as the former chief of staff rather than everybody else who was involved in the operation. There was a few things they did quite quickly that, you know, they instantly announced their planning reforms. They were talking about Great British Energy very quickly, rail nationalisation. Those things happened quite quickly. But you're right, not the things that like were really, really needed.
You know, the two most crucial things. cost of living and the NHS. I'm just talking about going into this winter. You know, we're sort of all being asked to accept that there's going to be people on hospital gurneys. And I think that I actually think the public would be understanding of that if there was a sense that there had been some kind of attempt to put policies in place that would mitigate against that. And I think this is also true of the Democrats. There was a very 11th hour attempt by the Harris campaign to put some kind of policy in place to prevent price gouging by big supermarkets. And, you know, part of the reason that your shop is more expensive is because, you know, of various inflationary crises, but those costs are being passed to you by the supermarkets. Yeah. It's not, we need to stop talking about inflation like it's this like act of God that nobody has any power to deal with. Price gouging and, you know, the passing of costs onto the consumer in essentials like groceries is something that I would have thought particularly a centre-left government would be concerned with dealing with.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. And I think some of this you can pin down to maybe inexperience of government. Yeah. There aren't a lot of Labour grandees who have experience of governing within the government. And I think that actually does show. There are always teething problems around new governments. That is true. But has there ever been teething problems at a time of, as you say, such acute crisis and with such a lack of patience from the general public? And I think Labour have now cottoned onto that, and that is what is forming this reset.
Whilst I hear all of that, there is just a part of me that is like, I just don't fully buy that you didn't know how thin the patience of the public is. Yes. And how desperate they are. I just
also,
it's on the front page of every paper.
You can't say we're going to take your nan's winter fuel allowance off her, but it's not going to make a difference anyway for 10 years. Everything's just going to be terrible. It's like, well, don't do it then. You know, exactly, you have to get your narrative in order.
Do you want to hear my sound like I'm high thought? Sue
Always.
Gray, same initials as Scapegoat.
Oh,
yeah.
My goodness.
Oh, yeah. That's why they come in scintillating.
How do I know the colours you see are the same as the colours I see? Here we go. Now we're smoking weed. Now we're smoking weed in the sixth form common room.